There is an old saying that says if you're bored, then your reader was bored 10 pages ago. This principle is generally true, but it isn't always necessarily the case. If you've spent an inordinate amount of time on one story or in a certain part of your story, then it's likely that your story has become boring and seems dull. However, if you give your story to a new reader, then they may find it exciting. Something is often exciting when it's new. This means that your story isn't actually boring, and maybe all you need to do is put it down for a while, and give yourself a break, and then continue your writing. Unfortunately, the only way to know if this is the case is to give it to somebody else to read, and we don't always want to do that. So, if you're feeling bored, it's probably far more likely that your story is actually boring, and there are a number of reasons why this could be the case. First, over-explanation or using too much exposition can make your story feel boring. This is why many people don't like to read Tolkien. These people are wrong, of course, but that doesn't mean that there aren't parts of The Lord of the Rings that are slow and boring. And Tolkien's style with his exposition is probably the reason for that. It's easy to fall into that trap of dumping exposition everywhere on the page because you're writing and describing what you're seeing in your imagination. Description is an easy crutch because it allows you to put words on the page and feel like you've moved your story forward. And I get it, sometimes you just have to see words on a page. But words on a page doesn't inherently mean that you've written something meaningful for your story. In my opinion, this is the reason why exposition can sometimes make your story feel boring, because you're not writing something that is exciting and pushing your plot forward. Another common source of exposition is called talking head syndrome. Talking head syndrome is exposition through the eyes of your point of view character. Now, exposition through the eyes of your point of view character is actually an important part of a good story. You have to have it. But when it becomes too excessive, it gets boring. But just because it's boring doesn't mean it isn't understandable. It's an easy crutch. I find that it comes out in my writing when I don't have a clear direction for my story or for my characters. I think that having a plan for what you're writing will generally eliminate this. Unless, of course, it's just your natural proclivity to write like that. In this case, just know that if you do it too much, it'll probably be boring. Oddly enough, another source of boredom for writers and readers is also a lack of exposition and explanation. Description of what's going on around a character adds to the immersion of the reader and will help it become more real for you as a writer. To do this correctly, it's important to bring in all forms of sensory input into that description. It shouldn't just be what your character sees, but what they smell and what they taste. It's a really good idea to bring in all 5 senses to your description. And that's something that I frequently forget. Another thing you can do to fight boredom is to tie the sensory details to the plot. Nobody cares that the air felt musty against his skin if there isn't a reason for the air to feel musty. Now, that reason could be implied. Maybe they're in a dark cavern or a cave or something. In this case, the reader would expect the air to feel different. But sometimes descriptions can cut against the implication and be unique to your story or your world. Maybe your characters are in a dark cavern, but the air feels normal and clean and easy to breathe. This would cut against expectations and could lead to an ominous feeling. Unique descriptions like this will make your story more memorable and go a long way in fighting off the boredom that can set in for both the reader and for you as the writer. Earlier, I talked about having a plan to help pull your characters in a meaningful direction, but this plan should revolve around things that bring interest to your story. If your plan sucks, then your writing will still be boring. This is true even if your characters are headed in a somewhat meaningful direction, which is the point of a plan, in my opinion, is to get your characters moving in meaningful directions. So let's go over some ideas that will help you craft a plan that doesn't suck. Now, when I say plan, I don't necessarily mean an outline. Though I do love a good outline, you don't need one to write an interesting story. But you do need some sort of plan. And I'm using the word here that pretty loosely and broad. It can be something as simple as an interesting question that's pulling you as the writer forward. Maybe you don't quite understand your character yet. Maybe your character hasn't revealed who they really are yet, which is interesting that happens, but I think it's pretty cool. And who is this character really is an interesting question for a writer. Your plan could be an idea for tension and conflict. Without tension, you definitely have a boring story. Tension and conflict are the building blocks of interest. So sometimes a plan is just an idea for how your scene is going to that you're going to write today is going to provide tension and conflict that you need. It's a pretty simple formula, actually. What do your characters want versus what's standing in their way? As a writer, it's important that you put obstacles that separate your characters' wants from what they currently have. Another loose plan is an idea for putting your character into an interesting spot. I love to think of weird or awkward situations and positions that I could stick my characters in. And what makes these positions strange could be a whole variety of reasons, and it truly depends on the character. If you have a character that is quiet, it's interesting to put them in a situation where they have to speak or suffer the consequences for staying silent. Or if you could take a selfish character and put them in a situation where they are forced to serve others. Putting characters in situations that go against their nature is one of my favorite ways to fight off the boredom of writing. Another fairly common difficulty that can make your story seem boring is the time between the first word of your book and the inciting incident. There is no set amount of words or pages in which the inciting incident must happen, but generally, the sooner it happens, the better. The longer it takes to get into the story, the more boring your story becomes. One way to get around this is to write as much as you want and then throw out the first chapter or two. Probably the most common reason that your story feels boring is that your characters have a lack of goals and direction. If your characters don't have clear goals, it kind of reminds me of a 40-year-old who still lives with their parents and doesn't have a job and isn't really doing anything with their lives. Now imagine trying to write a character like that. It would be pretty exhausting to have a character that didn't have a proactive bone in their body. Your characters need development, and they need growth and change. Now there are parts of a story that are inherently boring. The middle is notoriously hard to write through because that's typically when a story slows down, and it slows down because there's just a lot of time and space between the beginning hook and inciting incident to the climax of the story. The middle can seem especially boring for any and all of the reasons that I've already talked about. But let me know in the comments below what you find challenging or makes your story feel the most boring in the middle. I think it's pretty safe to say that your book must keep your interest if you have any hope of completing it, and if you have any hope of your reader actually completing their reading of it. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe, and thanks for watching.